The name factory might sound familiar, and it really is. We already discussed factory methods in this course in previous lectures, mainly around layers. But now let's do a real deep dive into the factory pattern and provide the full motivation and explanation for it. So what is the factory pattern? Simply put, the factory pattern is a pattern that allows creating objects without specifying the exact class of the object. Now, why would we want to do that? As we already discussed, specifying the class in the creating code will create a strong coupling and will tie the code to the class. If later we will need to use another class for implementing the same logic, we will have to modify all the code that creates the class, which can be scattered all across the application. So the factory pattern allows us to avoid such a strong coupling. How is it implemented? Well, let's look at an example. Say we have an application that needs to know the weather forecast in various cities around the world. Now, there are multiple providers of weather forecasts, and the developers decided to go with a provider named Hot or Not Weather. They created a class called HON, or HON Weather, with a method named GetWeather that accepts the city name and the date. The GetWeather method returns a number which represents the temperature in the given city on the given date. Here's an example of a code using this class. This is a straightforward implementation and it looks quite innocent. 6 months after the site went on production, the hugely successful Hot or Not Weather went out of business, and the developers had to find a replacement. After a hurried search, they found one, named Either Neither Weather. They created another class named EN Weather with the same method signature, GetWeather, that accepts the same arguments, city and date, and returned the same value, the temperature. Now what? Now, since the previous class, HON Weather, was directly created by the code using the new keyword, the team has to find all the places this class is used and change the code to create an instance of the EN Weather class instead of the HON Weather class. This is a tedious, boring, and an error-prone job. What the team found out is that new is glue. This is a common saying among developers and architects, and it shows that whenever we use the new keyword, we glue the code and the class together. The factory pattern proposes a solution for this. Using the factory pattern, we would do this. Create an interface named iWeatherProvider. This interface has a single method named, you guessed it, GetWeather, accepting the city name and a date, and returning the temperature. 2. Make the HON Weather and EN Weather class implement this interface. Create a factory method. Let's call this method GetWeatherProvider, and it will return an implementation of the iWeatherProvider interface. This method will simply return an instance of the HON Weather. That's all, a one-liner. But this one line changes everything. From now on, when the code needs to access weather information, instead of calling directly to HON Weather, it will call the factory method, get the instance, and act on it. The code will have no idea what is a concrete class it's using, and that makes the change a very easy experience. When the developers will need to switch from HON Weather to EN Weather, all they need to do is to modify the code in the factory method. That's it. See how easy it is? Using the factory method will definitely make your code easier to maintain, which is one of the major goals of the architect. Now, there are some more complicated types of factory methods. For example, let's say we have 2 weather providers, one for Asia and one for Europe. We need the code to be indifferent to the location we want the weather forecast for, and so we use the factory method as a place to make a decision about which instance to return. For example, our weather classes are called, surprisingly enough, Europe Weather and Asia Weather, and they both implement the iWeatherProvider interface. Our factory will now look like this. As you can see, the factory method accepts the continent name of the required weather forecast and returns a different instance based on it. This is a quite common pattern in factories, and there are a lot of examples of factories making a decision on the specific instance to be returned. Another common pattern is to use an external configuration file for deciding which instance to return. So that is a factory pattern, and as you probably already understood, it is hugely popular, and rightly so. It will make your life much easier, and the code will be more readable, flexible, and easy to maintain. In addition, the factory pattern is often a base for other patterns, as we will see in the repository pattern. So the bottom line is simple. Always strive to use the factory pattern. Remember, new is glue. Avoid strong coupling with a factory pattern.